Would you choose to let your daughter die rather than see her live as a slave? This is a difficult question derived from a real-life story that deserves to be told. A story about tough choices, the fight for freedom, and the lengths people will go to protect their loved ones in the most challenging times. It's a story that makes us think about the real cost of survival and what it truly means to be free. In the era of slavery, one certain woman's desperate plea for freedom would set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundation of antebellum America. Margaret Garner, a courageous and defiant mother, faced an impossible choice that would forever alter the course of her and millions of others' lives. Join us as we explore the tragic journey of Margaret Garner, a figure whose legacy challenges us to confront the deepest injustices of our past. In the middle of the 1850s, the United States was a nation on the brink. Tensions between the North and the South simmered, fueled by the contrasting ideologies of freedom and slavery. For many, the notion of escaping slavery was a distant dream. But for those who dared to flee, the stakes were high. Freedom on one side, and on the other, the full force of a law that would stop at nothing to drag them back into bondage. Margaret Garner was a woman who, like many others, knew the sting of the lash, the back-breaking toil of the fields, and the suffocating fear of the overseer's wrath. But she was also a mother, and it was this role that would lead her to make a decision so desperate, so audacious, that it would reverberate across the country and find its place in the annals of American history. Born into slavery on a plantation in Boone County, Kentucky, Margaret Garner's life was one of relentless hardship. She was the property of Archibald Gaines, a man who, like many slaveholders of the time, believed in the absolute subjugation of those he owned. Margaret's daily existence was a brutal one, filled with exhausting labor and constant fear. Yet amidst this harsh reality, Margaret found moments of solace in her family. She was married to Robert Garner, a fellow slave, and together they had 4 children. The Garner family lived under constant threat. They knew that at any moment they could be separated, sold off to different owners, and torn apart forever. This was the cruel reality of slavery, a reality that drove many to the brink of despair. But for Margaret, it sparked a fire, a determination to escape the chains that bound her and her family. By the mid-1850s, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made the stakes of escaping slavery even higher. This law mandated that escaped slaves found anywhere in the United States be returned to their owners, no matter if they had reached a free state. It also imposed severe penalties on anyone who aided their escape, effectively turning the entire country into a hunting ground for runaway slaves. Despite these dangers, or perhaps because of them, Margaret and Robert began to plot their escape. The Garners had heard of the Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses established by abolitionists to help enslaved people escape to free states in Canada. They knew it was a long shot, but staying meant certain continued bondage for themselves and their children. One cold January night in 1856, with the Ohio River frozen over, the Garners decided to make their move. The icy conditions provided a rare opportunity to cross the river on foot, avoiding the heavily patrolled ferries. They packed what little they had, bundled up their children, and under the cover of darkness began their perilous journey to freedom. This was not a journey undertaken by the Garners alone. A group of 17 enslaved people from the same neighborhood, including Robert and Margaret Garner, banded together for the escape. They used a large sled and 2 horses stolen from their enslavers, driving at full speed through the snow-covered roads. One of the stolen items was a gun, an essential tool for survival in the perilous bid for freedom. The Ohio River was a treacherous barrier between slavery and freedom. Even when frozen, the river was unpredictable. Its ice could crack without warning, swallowing anyone who dared to cross. As Margaret and her family stepped onto the ice, every sound seemed amplified in the cold night air. The wind howled, the ice creaked underfoot, and the children shivered in their parents' arms. With each step, the Garners knew they were leaving behind the only world they had ever known. But ahead lay the possibility of freedom, a chance to live without the constant fear of being torn apart. Their goal was the house of a free black man named Elijah Kite, who lived just across the river in Cincinnati, Ohio. Kite was known to help runaways, and the Garners hoped that once they reached his home, they would find shelter and the means to continue their journey north. The Garners reached Kite's house just before dawn, exhausted but hopeful. Kite welcomed them in, offering food, warmth, and a place to rest. But the respite was brief. News of their escape had already begun to spread, and the Garners soon learned that Gaines, their owner, had enlisted the help of federal marshals to track them down. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that Gaines had the law on his side, and he was determined to reclaim what he saw as his property. Kite, realizing the danger that was fast approaching, urged the Garners to flee again. But where could they go? The cold reality was setting in. Their journey to freedom was far from guaranteed. The specter of capture loomed over them, and with each passing hour, the walls seemed to close in. Margaret and Robert knew they had to keep moving, but they also knew that the odds were against them. The city was crawling with bounty hunters, ready to pounce on any runaway they could find. They had no time to lose, yet every step they took seemed to lead them closer to danger. Before they could make their next move, the house was surrounded. Gaines, accompanied by federal marshals and local law enforcement, had tracked them down. The Garners, trapped with no way out, faced a terrifying reality. They were about to be captured and returned to slavery. In that moment, a fierce resolve took hold of Margaret. She looked at her children, their innocent faces filled with fear and confusion, and she knew she could not let them be taken back. The thought of them growing up under the same brutal conditions she had endured was unbearable. She had to act, no matter the cost. As the men outside prepared to storm the house, Margaret's mind raced. She had heard stories of other runaways who had fought back, who had taken drastic measures to protect their families. She had no weapons, no real means of defense, but she had her determination. As the men closed in, Robert Garner fired a shot from within, grazing one of the pursuers and forcing them to hesitate. But the attackers were undeterred. They began battering down the door with timber, determined to complete their mission. Robert fired several more shots, wounding one of the officers, but he was quickly overpowered and dragged from the house. In that moment, Margaret Garner, her eyes reflecting the futility of hope and the inescapable reality of her situation, made the heart-wrenching decision she had promised herself. She grabbed a shovel and struck two of her children, knocking them unconscious. Then, without hesitation, she seized a butcher knife from the table. In one swift motion, she slit the throat of her young daughter, Mary, who was just 2.5 years old, an agonizing choice made in desperation to protect her from a life of slavery. The room fell silent as Margaret's actions shocked everyone present. She then attempted to end the life of her surviving child and take her own, but she was overpowered before she could carry out her final act. Her captors quickly restrained her, halting the tragedy before it could unfold further. Margaret was arrested along with Robert and their surviving children. The case quickly became a flashpoint for national debate. In interviews later, she expressed no regret and revealed that she had been planning to do the deed if the time came, stating that she would rather see her children dead than be subjected to the suffering she had endured. The Garners remained in jail for nearly a month as legal battles raged on. Margaret Garner's story attracted widespread attention, both nationally and internationally. Throughout their time in jail, visitors streamed in to offer their sympathies. Levi Coffin, an abolitionist, described the heartbreaking atmosphere.
Those who came to speak words of comfort and cheer felt them die upon their lips when they looked into Mrs. Garner's face and marked the unspeakable expression of agony. Her sorrow was beyond the reach of any words of encouragement and consolation, and can be realized in all its fullness only by those who have tasted of a cup equally bitter.
Many visitors noticed scars on Margaret's face. When asked about them, she would only say,
"White man struck me."
Others observed the light complexion of her children, leading to speculation about sexual abuse by her enslaver. Among those who visited Margaret was Lucy Stone, a prominent abolitionist who had recently returned to Cincinnati. Stone's efforts to console Margaret sparked a rumor that she had tried to provide Margaret with a knife to end her life, and the lives of her children, if the trial went poorly. This accusation was made publicly in court by Colonel Chambers, the slaveholder's attorney. Outraged by the claim, Stone asked to address the court after it adjourned for the day. Speaking with calm resolve, she delivered a statement to the packed room.
"I am only sorry that I was not in when Colonel Chambers said what he did about me and my giving a knife to Margaret. When I saw that poor fugitive, took her toil-hardened hand in mine, and read in her face deep suffering and an ardent longing for freedom, I could not help but bid her be of good cheer. I told her that 1,000 hearts were aching for her, and that they were glad one child of hers was safe with the angels. Her only reply was a look of deep despair, of anguish such as no words can speak. I thought the spirit she manifested was the same as that of our ancestors, to whom we had erected the monument at Bunker Hill, the spirit that would rather let us all go back to God than back to slavery. The faded faces of the Negro children tell too plainly to what degradation female slaves must submit. Rather than give her little daughter to that life, she killed her. If in her deep maternal love she felt the impulse to send her child back to God, to save it from coming woe, who shall say she had no right to do so? That desire had its root in the deepest and holiest feelings of our nature, implanted alike in black and white by our common Father. With my own teeth I would tear open my veins and let the earth drink my blood rather than wear the chains of slavery. How then could I blame her for wishing her child to find freedom with God and the angels, where no chains are? I know not whether this commissioner has children, else I would appeal to him to know how he would feel to have them torn from him. But I feel that he will not disregard the book which says, "Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place which he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best."
Another notable visitor to Margaret was P.S. Bassett, an American Baptist minister. He met Margaret and her mother-in-law 2 weeks after the incident and shared his experience.
Last Sabbath, after preaching in the city prison in Cincinnati, the deputy sheriff allowed me to visit the apartment of that unfortunate woman. I found her holding an infant only a few months old. I noticed a large bump on the baby's forehead and asked about it. Margaret told me in detail about her attempt to kill her children. She explained that when the officers and slaveholders came to the house, she grabbed a shovel and struck 2 of her children on the head. Then she took a knife, cut the throat of the 3rd child, and tried to kill the last one. She said that if they had given her time, she would have killed them all. Regarding herself, she cared little, but she could not bear the thought of her children suffering as she had. When I asked if she had been overcome with madness at the time, she calmly replied,
No, I was as cool as I am now and would much rather kill them at once and thus end their sufferings than have them taken back to slavery and be murdered piece by piece.
The 2 men, Robert Garner and Simon Garner, and the other 2 children were in another room. Margaret's mother-in-law, however, was with her. The older woman shared her own grief. She said she was the mother of 8 children, most of whom had been separated from her. She described how her husband had been taken from her for 25 years, during which time she didn't see him. She said she would have preferred that he never return, as she didn't want him to witness her suffering or endure the brutality he would face. She explained that, despite being a faithful servant, her master's cruelty increased as she aged and became less able to work. She decided to make the escape attempt, knowing it could result in death. For her, it was better than continuing to endure such oppression. Speaking about Margaret's actions, she neither encouraged nor discouraged them, but admitted that she might have done the same under similar circumstances. The old woman, between 60 and 70 years old, was deeply religious. She spoke of her hope to one day find rest with her Savior, where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest.
Margaret's trial was a spectacle that drew crowds from all over. The prosecution sought to portray her as a cold-blooded killer, while the defense argued that she had acted out of self-defense and desperation, driven to the brink by the inhumane conditions of slavery. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of whom had come to see the woman who had committed such a shocking act. During the trial, Margaret and her husband were represented by prominent abolitionist lawyers, including John Jolliffe, Cassius M. Clay, and Lucy Stone, a remarkably vocal anti-slavery activist. The defense argued that Margaret's actions were a direct result of the inhumane institution of slavery, where enslaved individuals had no control over their lives or the well-being of their loved ones. The legal team emphasized the cruelty of the system and how it pushed people to the brink, stripping them of their humanity. The defense also attempted to prove that Margaret Garner had been liberated under a former law covering slaves taken into free states for other work. Her attorney proposed that she be charged with murder, hoping the case would be tried in a free state, where she might later be pardoned by the governor. The prosecuting attorney, however, argued that the federal fugitive slave law took precedence over state murder charges. The trial drew a crowd of over 1,000 people each day, with 500 men deputized to maintain order in the town. The presiding judge, Pendery, ruled that federal fugitive warrants had supervening authority, overriding state law. In response, defense attorney John Jolliffe argued that the Fugitive Slave Act violated the guarantee of religious freedom by compelling citizens to participate in evil by returning slaves to bondage. Pendery rejected this argument, and the trial continued. On the closing day of the trial, the abolitionist Lucy Stone took the stand to defend her earlier conversations with Margaret. She spoke about the interracial sexual relationship that underlay part of the case, addressing the cultural tensions surrounding Margaret's situation. Margaret Garner's actions were driven by her master's abuse, and the well-known abuse slaves faced nationwide. Women were known to practice infanticide to alleviate the burden of slavery from their children. However, in Garner's case, her children faced even more opposition due to their mulatto status. Mulattoes were seen as a threat and a disgrace among the plantation and white families because the birth of mulatto children highlighted infidelity within the slave-owning families. They reminded the family of a perceived sin and were often beaten or sold. Garner underwent drastic measures to protect her child, not only from the cruelty of the institution of slavery, but from the double threat posed by her child's mulatto status. But despite the touching appeals and eloquent pleadings, the commissioner ordered that the fugitives be returned to slavery. As a result, Margaret Garner was not immediately tried for murder, but was forced to return to a slave state, accompanied by Robert and their youngest child, a daughter of about 9 months old. When Ohio authorities later sought an extradition warrant to try her for murder, they couldn't find her for the arrest. Gaines, her owner, kept moving her between cities in Kentucky to avoid the authorities. Ohio officials narrowly missed Margaret Garner multiple times, first in Covington by mere hours, then in Frankfort, and finally in Louisville, where they encountered her enslaver. By then, he had already placed the enslaved individuals, including Margaret, on a steamboat bound for his brother's Arkansas plantation. On March 6, 1856, tragedy struck. The Henry Louis, the steamboat carrying the Garners, collided with another vessel and began to sink. Accounts of what happened next differ. Some say Margaret and her baby daughter were thrown overboard during the chaos. Others claim Margaret deliberately jumped into the river after throwing her baby into the water. The outcome was devastating. The baby drowned. Witnesses later reported that Margaret expressed frantic joy over her child's death, believing it was better than a life in slavery. She even attempted to end her own life. Shortly after, Margaret and her husband, Robert, were taken to Arkansas, though they remained there briefly. They were soon sent to New Orleans, where Margaret was forced to work as a household servant for Gaines's family friends. After this, the Garners vanished from public record. Years later, in 1870, a Cincinnati Chronicle reporter uncovered Robert Garner's story. He revealed that he and Margaret had been sold in 1857 to Judge DeWitt Clinton Bonham for plantation labor in Mississippi. Margaret tragically succumbed to typhoid fever during a valley epidemic in 1858. Before her death, Margaret made a powerful plea to Robert, urging him never to remarry in slavery and to hold on to the hope of freedom. Margaret Garner's story did not end with her return to slavery. Instead, it became a powerful symbol in the fight against the institution of slavery. The details of her life and her desperate act were widely publicized, and her trial became a spectacle that drew national attention. Abolitionists seized upon her case, using it to stress the inhumanity of slavery and to rally support for their cause. Margaret's actions, though tragic, became a focal point in the struggle to end slavery. Her case showed how deeply divided the country was, with some people seeing slavery as morally wrong and others viewing it as essential for the economy. The public's response to her case was split, mirroring the wider societal divide. Abolitionists saw her as a martyr, a symbol of the lengths to which a mother would go to protect her children from the horrors of slavery. They used her story to argue for the abolition of the institution and to draw attention to the plight of enslaved people. On the other hand, those who supported slavery or were ambivalent about its morality saw Margaret's actions as a criminal act. They argued that her decision to kill her child was inexcusable, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. This viewpoint was part of a broader effort to justify and maintain the institution of slavery by portraying those who resisted as dangerous and irrational. The public discourse surrounding Margaret Garner's case was intense and passionate. The media coverage varied, with some outlets sympathetic to her plight and others condemning her actions. The trial was a spectacle that drew crowds and generated heated debates about the nature of slavery, the rights of enslaved people, and the limits of human endurance. Margaret's story was covered in newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches, each interpretation adding to the growing body of literature and discussion about slavery and resistance. Despite the harsh circumstances of her final years, Margaret Garner's legacy endured. Her story was retold and remembered as a powerful example of the inhumanity of slavery and the lengths to which a mother would go to protect her children. The memory of her desperate act and the brutal system that drove her to it became a potent symbol in the fight for abolition and played a part in the eventual success of that movement. Margaret Garner's story reminds us of the harsh realities of slavery and the brave efforts of those who stood against it. It calls us to remember and honor the sacrifices made for justice and to stand up for a better, fairer world. Thank you for staying until the end of this important story. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you can join us in even more thought-provoking discussions. Now, what are your thoughts about this story? Would you have done the same? Why or why not? Share your insights in the comments below and keep the conversation going. See you in the next video.